What happens when a well-loved television icon sits down for what should have been a friendly interview, only to find herself facing a line of questioning that quickly turns hostile and forces her to defend not only her work but the reputation she has built over decades? One particular morning on daytime television became a shocking example of how rapidly a casual conversation can transform into a tense confrontation. The situation unfolded when Courteney Cox appeared as a guest on a popular talk show, expecting a simple promotional chat, but instead encountering an exchange that many viewers would later describe as one of the most uncomfortable moments broadcast live. The mood inside the studio had initially been upbeat. Courteney Cox entered with the familiar warmth audiences have known for years, greeting the hosts with an easy smile as she took her seat. The panel, including Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and Alyssa Farah Griffin, welcomed her enthusiastically. Their early questions focused on her current work, future projects, and reflections on her long career in entertainment. The discussion moved along smoothly, the audience relaxed, and the conversation felt like any typical celebrity appearance. For nearly 10 minutes everything proceeded normally. Then Joy Behar, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the earlier part of the segment, leaned forward in her chair. Her expression changed the tone of the room almost immediately. When she began to speak, her voice carried a sharp edge that made it clear she intended to shift the conversation in a very different direction. "You know, Courteney," she began, "there's something I've always wondered." The way she delivered the comment made several people in the studio pause. She continued by questioning whether it seemed too convenient that Cox had managed to remain so successful and relevant in Hollywood long after Friends ended, while some of her former co-stars had struggled with personal issues or career setbacks. The remark caught Cox off guard. Her smile faded slightly as she tried to understand what Behar was implying. She calmly asked what exactly she meant by calling her continued success convenient. Even though her tone remained steady, the surprise was clear in her expression. Instead of softening the question, Behar pushed further. She pointed out that Cox had continued landing successful shows and maintained a strong public image, while others from the Friends cast had dealt with addiction, personal troubles, or financial hardships. The suggestion hanging in the air was that Cox had somehow benefited from circumstances that made her path easier. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The hosts beside Behar exchanged uneasy looks. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to redirect the conversation back toward Cox's new projects, sensing the rising tension. But Behar interrupted, insisting that the topic mattered and deserved discussion. She referenced the widely known struggles of Matthew Perry and hinted at difficulties some of the other actors had faced over the years. Meanwhile, she noted, Cox appeared poised and successful, promoting yet another project. Behar then asked whether Cox ever felt guilty about that contrast. Cox's posture stiffened as she absorbed the comment. She asked what exactly she was supposed to feel guilty about. Working hard and making decisions that kept her grounded. Her words remained controlled, but the tension in her jaw showed that the accusation had struck a nerve. Behar replied that she was not implying anything subtle. She claimed she was simply asking directly whether Cox had benefited from being the safe choice in Hollywood while others took bigger risks that did not always succeed. The studio audience fell silent. The calm interview atmosphere had completely vanished, replaced by a thick tension that everyone could feel. Cox tried to maintain the professionalism she had developed through years in the spotlight, yet there was now a visible intensity in her eyes. She responded that Behar's characterization was unfair both to her and to her friends. Every member of the Friends cast, she said, had faced their own challenges and made their own choices in life and career. Suggesting that she held some unfair advantage, or should feel guilty about continuing to work, was insulting not only to her but also to the people she cared about. Behar reacted with a dismissive scoff, brushing aside the diplomatic explanation. She argued that everyone in Hollywood knows there is a hierarchy and that some individuals simply learn how to navigate it more effectively than others. According to her, Cox had clearly mastered that system. The accusation lingered heavily in the room. Cox gripped the sides of her chair as she stared directly at Behar. Her voice dropped lower, more serious now, as she asked whether Behar was truly suggesting that her success was undeserved, or that she had somehow manipulated her way through the industry while others struggled. If that was the claim, Cox said, then the conversation needed to change entirely. Behar, either ignoring the warning or choosing to push further, doubled down. She argued that what she was saying was widely understood in the industry but rarely spoken aloud. Some people get lucky, she said. Some receive protection, and some know exactly how to push the right buttons to stay successful. According to her, Cox had been particularly good at all three. At that moment, something shifted. The carefully polished public persona Cox had maintained throughout the interview seemed to disappear. In its place appeared a more direct and unfiltered side of the actress, one that carried a clear sense of frustration and strength. When she spoke again, Her voice carried authority that commanded the room's attention. She explained that she had been trying to remain polite and assumed perhaps Behar simply had a poorly phrased question, or a point she wanted to express. But it now seemed clear that the line of questioning was not about honest discussion or journalism. Instead, it felt like an attempt to diminish someone who had spent her life working to build a meaningful career. The other host sat frozen, uncertain whether stepping in would help or make matters worse. Whoopi Goldberg watched closely, clearly weighing whether she should intervene, while Sarah Haynes and Alyssa Farah Griffin appeared visibly uncomfortable. Behar, sensing the growing backlash yet refusing to retreat, insisted she was merely asking questions that needed to be asked. Public figures, she argued, should be held accountable for the advantages they enjoy. Cox responded by asking what exactly she was supposed to be accountable for. Was it for maintaining steady work? For choosing projects carefully? For surrounding herself with supportive people? Staying away from tabloid drama, and keeping her personal life private? As the exchange intensified, Behar's expression hardened. Rather than easing the tension, she escalated again, claiming the entertainment industry often hands opportunities to certain people while others must struggle for every chance. Cox repeated the word slowly, her tone sharper now. Lucky. You think everything I've achieved comes down to luck? Courteney Cox said, her voice tightening with disbelief. She leaned forward slightly, clearly struggling to remain composed. Do you have any idea what it's like to sit through hundreds of auditions before landing the one role that finally changes your life? Do you understand the reality of working 18-hour days for years at a time, memorizing page after page of dialogue, hitting every mark perfectly, and carrying the pressure of millions of viewers watching every move you make? Ajoy Behar responded with a dismissive wave of her hand, a gesture that instantly escalated the tension. Oh please, she said with a shrug. You were paid millions of dollars just to read lines on a television show. Let's not act like that's real suffering. A sharp gasp moved through the studio audience. The bluntness of the remark stunned the room. Even members of the production crew seemed to pause in place, aware that the exchange unfolding in front of them had shifted far beyond an ordinary interview. Cox's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with an intensity that made the entire room grow quiet. You know what, Joy, she said slowly. I've been part of this industry for more than 3 decades. In that time I've worked with hundreds of people, actors, directors, writers, crew members, executives, and not once have I encountered someone showing this level of disrespect toward the work that so many people pour their lives into. She paused briefly, her voice growing steadier yet sharper, and beyond that, I've rarely seen someone so determined to tear another person down for absolutely no reason. Behar seemed to realize the situation was slipping away from her control, but her pride kept her from backing off. Instead, she leaned further into the confrontation. Maybe if you spent less time acting like a victim and more time recognizing the privilege you've had, we could actually have a meaningful conversation. That statement proved to be the final spark. Cox stood up abruptly from her chair, the sudden movement sending a ripple of shock through the studio. Her voice rose, echoing across the set with unmistakable force. Privilege, she repeated. You want to talk about privilege? Let's talk about yours, Joy. Her words came faster now, fueled by visible frustration. You sit behind that desk every day and criticize people who are expected to stay polite and professional while you take shots at them. You throw out accusations with no consequences. You pass judgment on people's entire careers without knowing what they've actually gone through. And you do it in front of millions of viewers like it's some kind of entertainment. The other hosts looked stunned. Whoopi Goldberg finally tried to step in, raising a hand in an attempt to calm the situation. Ladies, maybe we should all take a moment and breathe, she said carefully, trying to bring the conversation back under control. But Cox wasn't ready to stop. No, she replied firmly, her attention fixed squarely on Behar. I'm not finished. You asked your questions. Now I'm going to ask a few of my own. The entire studio remained silent. When was the last time you created something meaningful? Cox continued. When was the last time you took a creative risk that could have failed? When was the last time you actually built something instead of sitting back and tearing other people's work apart? Behar looked momentarily stunned, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for a response that wouldn't come. I'm a comedian, she finally began, attempting to defend herself. I comment on. You're a bully, Cox interrupted sharply, her words slicing through the explanation. You hide behind the label of comedy or journalism, or whatever you want to call it, she continued. But what you're really doing is using your platform to belittle other people, and the worst part is you seem to enjoy doing it. The silence in the studio was overwhelming. Crew members who normally stayed focused on their technical tasks were now watching the confrontation unfold, fully aware they were witnessing a moment that would likely be talked about for years. For perhaps the first time during her time on the show, Behar looked genuinely shaken. The confidence that usually defined her on-air persona had faded. "That's not fair," she said, her voice lacking the certainty it carried earlier. "I'm doing my job. I ask difficult questions. That's what journalists do." Cox let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Tell questions," she repeated. "Is that what you think this is?" She shook her head slightly before continuing. "Let me explain something about real tough questions. Tough questions are based on facts. They exist for a purpose beyond hurting someone. They're asked because someone genuinely wants to understand something important or reveal the truth." Her voice sharpened again. "What you've been doing here today isn't journalism," she said. "It's cruelty dressed up as professionalism." Behar tried to recover, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The earlier edge in her voice had disappeared. "I think you might be overreacting," she said cautiously. "There are legitimate concerns about—" "Stop," Cox said firmly, raising her hand. The single word cut through the air, bringing the conversation to an abrupt halt. "There's nothing reasonable about what you did here today," Courteney Cox said firmly. Her voice had settled into a calm but powerful tone. "You came into this conversation already planning to attack me. And when I didn't fall apart the way you expected, you just pushed harder." She held Joy Behar's gaze without hesitation. "But here's what you clearly didn't anticipate. I didn't reach this point in my life by being fragile. I didn't stay in this industry for more than 30 years by letting people push me around." The cameras captured every shift in Cox's expression. As she continued speaking, her words were measured, controlled, yet filled with unmistakable authority. "You want to talk about privilege," she said. "Real privilege is sitting comfortably in judgment of others while never having to put yourself on the line. Real privilege is having a platform where you can say almost anything without facing real consequences. Real privilege is never building something yourself yet feeling entitled to tear down what others have spent years creating." The Joy made one last effort to regain control of the situation. Her voice sounded strained compared to earlier. "I think you're taking this way too personally," she said. "This is television. It's just a discussion." The Cox shook her head slowly. "No, Joy," she replied. "This isn't just television. And it's definitely not just conversation. This is you using your position to try to embarrass someone for entertainment. This is you attempting to undermine decades of hard work with baseless claims and cheap criticism. And most importantly, it's you showing everyone exactly who you are when you think no one will challenge you." The atmosphere in the studio had grown almost unbearable. The tension hung in the air like a storm ready to break. Joy, visibly shaken but still holding onto her confrontational stance, made one final comment that would push the situation even further. "You know what, Courteney," she said. "Maybe you're reacting this strongly because somewhere deep down you know I'm right. Maybe you realize your success isn't really about talent." The statement landed like a shockwave. A collective gasp rose from the audience. Even the experienced camera operators seemed stunned by the boldness of the remark. Cox stood perfectly still for a moment, staring at Joy with an expression that blended disbelief and anger. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a force that filled the room. "Did you just question my talent?" she asked slowly. "Did you really sit there on national television and suggest that 30 years of work, a decade on Friends, numerous successful projects, professional relationships across this entire industry, and the respect I've earned from my peers is all just some accident?" Joy seemed to realize she had crossed a line. She attempted a weak correction. "I didn't mean it like that," she began. "Oh no," Cox interrupted firmly. "You meant exactly what you said." Her voice grew stronger with every word. "Because that's what you do, isn't it? That's your entire approach. You tear people down. You question their value. You try to make others feel small so you can feel bigger." She continued, her tone steady but intense. "But here's the part you don't seem to understand. Talent isn't something someone can fake for 30 years. Success built on nothing doesn't last 3 decades. And the respect of your peers isn't something you can buy or manipulate." The other hosts sat silently, stunned by the exchange. Whoopi Goldberg looked as though she wished she could disappear from the moment entirely, while Sarah Haynes covered part of her face with her hands. The audience remained completely captivated. It was clear to everyone watching that this moment would be remembered as one of the most explosive exchanges ever seen on daytime television. Cox continued speaking, her voice rising with emotion as she described what her career had truly meant. "You want to know what my talent actually is, Joy," she said. "It's showing up every single day and doing the work. It's treating every single person on a set with respect and professionalism. It's studying scripts, learning every line, finding the truth in the characters I portray, and giving audiences something real to feel." She paused briefly. "That's talent. That's what real talent looks like. Joy tried once more to respond. I just think people should be more honest about. Honest. Cox's voice suddenly surged with energy that made several people in the studio jump. You want honesty? She continued. Let's talk honestly about what this actually is. This has nothing to do with my career or my success or journalism. This is about you feeling threatened by someone who built something lasting while you've spent years criticizing others. Her words grew sharper. This is about your own insecurities showing themselves through attacks on people who represent everything you wish you could achieve but never have. The cameras captured every moment as Cox delivered what felt like a powerful, emotional release. You sit behind that desk every day, she said, protected by producers, lawyers, and a massive platform, throwing criticism at people who are actually out there creating things, building projects, contributing something meaningful. She took a step closer to the desk. And the moment someone finally pushes back, the moment someone calls you out for what you're really doing, suddenly you act surprised. Joy's face had turned pale. For the first time since the conversation began, she appeared completely speechless. The studio had become so quiet that the faint hum of the cameras seemed unusually loud. Cox stood confidently, her presence filling the space. But here's the truth, she said calmly. Your opinion of me, your attacks on my character, your attempts to diminish what I've accomplished, they mean absolutely nothing to me. She placed a hand over her chest briefly. Because I know exactly who I am. I know the work I've done, the relationships I've built, the people I've collaborated with, and the lives that have been touched by the projects I've been fortunate enough to be part of. Her voice softened slightly but remained firm. And no amount of small, petty criticism from someone like you will ever change that. A long silence filled the studio before Cox spoke again. What's really unfortunate here, Joy, she said, is that you had the chance to have a real conversation with someone who has spent 3 decades working in this business. She continued calmly. You could have asked about the craft of acting, about the challenges behind the scenes, about how television has changed over the years, about working with amazing colleagues, about the joy of creating something that brings happiness to millions of people. And she shook her head. Instead, you chose to show everyone exactly who you are. With that, Cox picked up her purse. Before leaving, she turned toward the camera. To anyone watching who has ever been criticized simply for succeeding, she said with quiet dignity, don't let anyone make you feel guilty for working hard or following your dreams. Never let someone else dim your light. She looked back toward Joy one final time. And the next time you decide to attack someone's life work on national television, maybe make sure you're talking to someone who won't push back. Then she walked off the set with her head held high, leaving behind a studio filled with stunned silence and a talk show host who had just learned what happens when someone underestimates the strength of a person who has spent 30 years proving themselves in one of the toughest industries in the world.